Hey guys, welcome back to Fragments of Faith. If you're listening or watching, could you do us a favor? Do all the podcast things, like, follow, subscribe, share, maybe leave a comment. It helps a lot and we really appreciate it. So, I want to jump in today without setting this up too much because the minute I try to explain what the episode is about, it starts to get watered down. And this one has been sitting with me for a long time. And every time I try to organize it, it stopped feeling honest.
Which usually means it's something that hasn't really been given language yet.
Or something we've been taught not to give language to. So I'm just going to say it the way that it comes out. No conclusions, no fixing it, just naming it. So I learned early on there are certain questions you're expected to keep to yourself. Not because they're inappropriate, not because they're harmful, but because they make people uncomfortable. And instead of those questions being engaged or explored, the solution was always the same. Don't say that out loud. But that doesn't bring clarity. It doesn't offer comfort. It doesn't answer the question. What it does is remove permission. Permission to say, this hurts. Permission to say, this is confusing. Permission to admit, this is really heavy or awful. Instead, the response you're supposed to reach for is different. What did I miss? What am I failing at? What do I need to fix? So the moment confusion or silence shows up, the assumption isn't that life is just hard, it's that I'm failing spiritually. And that's where these phrases come in. God's ways are higher than ours. Everything happens for a reason. Now, those phrases sound like humility, but what they often do is quietly move the weight of the problem onto the person who's hurting. Because suddenly, unanswered questions aren't about God anymore. It's about whether I'm faithful enough or patient enough, spiritual enough to make sense of everything. The focus shifts from what's happening to what's wrong with me. And once that happens, the question stops being curious. It feels dangerous to even have it because now it sounds like a personal failure. So let me say some of the ones that I don't feel like I'm allowed to ask. What if faith doesn't resolve this? Because no one prepares you for what happens when faith is present, but relief is not. And right behind that one comes the fear that no one really wants to name. What if I never get answers? Not later, not eventually, not in heaven. Like, what if this is much clarity as I get? And if that's true, what if the questions are all I have left? Like, I'm not trying to reject faith. I'm just trying to survive inside of it. When the answers stop working, when the silence just stretches on, when pretending costs more than honesty, I feel like questions aren't defiance. I feel like that's how I've kept breathing. Here's another one I didn't think I could ask. Why does unanswered prayer turn into self examination instead of grief? Like, why do I start questioning myself instead of being allowed to just be sad about what did or didn't happen? Why do I immediately assume I must have done something wrong when nothing changes? Why does silence feel like correction at the cost of that way of thinking? Like, it isn't just confusion. Like, that's learning to mistrust your own instincts. It's learning to second guess your grief. It's basically learning to stay quiet when something inside you is breaking. And then when the questions couldn't be answered, when there was no verse or framework, like no clean explanation, I was given another response. You'll just have to ask him when you get to heaven. I really hate that answer. Not because I want to know everything right now, I mean, that would be nice. But because of what the answer assumes, it assumes that I'm still going to want to ask. It assumes that I'm still going to care about this particular question and that I'm going to carry this question for an entire lifetime without it costing me anything. You'll understand someday sounds patient, but what it really asks for is indefinite silence. It turns real questions into like deferred conversations, bas- basically postponing understanding until the day you die. I don't feel like that's faith. I feel like that's spiritual procrastination because it delays honesty and relief and accountability and calls that delay wisdom. It asks me to live with unresolved grief, unresolved confusion, unresolved pain, and call that faithfulness. And some questions don't survive postponement. Like some of them aren't intellectual, they're relational. Like I'm not asking for information, I'm asking for presence. Which brings me to my next question. If God already knows the outcome, what's prayer actually for? Why do some prayers get answered clearly while others are met with nothing at all? Like not a no, not a yes, just silence. And then I'm told to trust. But trust usually grows from understanding. So why does God require trust when he won't give an explanation? Why does obedience seem more important than wanting to understand? Why can't I question God without being told that questioning itself is the problem? Why are questions treated like threats instead of invitations? And then when suffering enters the picture, everything gets way heavier. And why is suffering treated like proof of faith instead of just simply acknowledging that it's pain and it sucks? Like, why are some people told that their suffering has a purpose? And why are others rescued from their suffering? What determines who gets a miracle and who gets a lesson? And here's one that feels almost unsayable in church. Why does God get all the praise, but none of the accountability? When things go right, God gets the credit. When things go wrong, oh, it's free will, or it's the devil, or it's just a fallen world. But it's never God. And if that's true, why can't I be angry at God? Why can't I rage or curse him for my suffering without being warned about hell? Why is honest anger treated like a betrayal, but silence is treated like faith? Like I need to be quiet about it. I can't be outraged out loud, which tends to another question that I was kind of afraid to ask. Why is it always God's timing? Why is that phrase used to explain delay, but never absence? At what point is it okay for waiting to turn into questions? And this might be the hardest one for me to admit. Why are we told God is perfect and infallible, yet he describes himself as jealous and angry? While I'm told those same emotions make me sinful. Like, why am I held to a higher emotional standard than the God that I'm supposed to be imitating? If God is loving, why does his love sometimes feel conditional? Like, these aren't abstract questions. Like, these come from real prayers, real loss, real moments where faith did not feel like comfort. And I've been told that asking these questions maybe weakens faith. I don't believe that anymore. I think pretending they don't exist does because unspoken questions don't disappear. They turn into shame. They turn into self doubt. They turn into the quiet belief that something is wrong with you. I don't feel lost. I feel honest. I feel awake. Maybe the problem isn't that people ask too many questions. Maybe the problem is that faith communities don't often know what to do with these questions once they're spoken out loud.
Yeah, I want to I want to stay in a different lane than the questions themselves. Not because the questions don't matter, but because they've already done what they came to do. What I'm interested in is what happens after questions surface. What they reshape, what they destabilize, and what they quietly ask faith to become. Because here's something I've seen again and again. People don't usually walk away from faith because they asked hard questions. They walk away because unanswered questions don't stay isolated. Over time, they begin to reshape what a person believes faith is supposed to provide. Faith slowly becomes expected to explain what happened, to justify what hurts, to make peace with things that still feel unresolved. And when it doesn't, then faith starts to feel heavy instead of hopeful. Prayer becomes careful. Honesty starts to feel risky. Grief quietly turns into guilt. And when faith becomes something you have to monitor or carry instead of something that you can inhabit, exhaustion isn't far behind. So let me just name this plainly. Faith was never designed to make pain manageable. It doesn't exist to organize grief or to translate loss into meaning on our timeline. Faith doesn't remove the weight of suffering. It tells us where to stand while we're under it. When we expect more than that, we quietly set people up for collapse. Because the first time faith doesn't steady the ground, we assume it failed. Or worse, we assume we did. That's where so much internal damage begins. Not because belief disappears, but because belief turns inward and starts interrogating itself. Grief becomes a spiritual problem to solve. Silence becomes something we have to explain or explain away. Pain becomes evidence that something must be wrong. An explanation often feels safer than presence because presence requires patience. Explanation gives us the illusion of progress. Scripture, however, repeatedly refuses to rush people past the tension. One of the clearest places we see that is in Habakkuk. Habakkuk doesn't come to God with polished language. He comes with protest. He questions God's injustice. He names God's silence. He challenges God's inaction. And those aren't abstract reflections. They're lived questions spoken from the middle of confusion. And I feel like they echo a lot of the questions that you brought up today. And God answers him, but not by resolving the tension. God doesn't offer Habakkuk a framework that makes everything feel fair. He doesn't justify himself in a way that settles the moral discomfort. And that silence is not avoidance, it's intentional. Because an explanation might have answered Habakkuk's questions, but would have quietly shifted the relationship into negotiation. Instead of explaining his actions, God reasserts who he is. And in doing so, he reframes the entire relationship. In Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, God says, "The righteous shall live by faith." Now that line is not about optimism. It's not about blind belief. It's about orientation. Habakkuk is being told that faith is not built on full understanding. It's built on trust in God's character when understanding is withheld. That's uncomfortable for us because we tend to assume that trust grows out of clarity. Scripture suggests the opposite. Trust comes first. Understanding follows when it can. And sometimes it doesn't. That doesn't mean questions are unwelcome. Habakkuk asks them. It doesn't mean protest is sinful. Habakkuk protests. But what Habakkuk never does is move himself into the position of final authority. He doesn't conclude that unanswered questions invalidate God. He doesn't decide that silence means absence. He waits. And waiting is where faith is either deepened or it's quietly replaced. Because this is where the subtle shift can happen. Questions that begin as honest wrestling with God can slowly turn into criteria. Unspoken standards that God has to meet in order to remain trustworthy. And that shift doesn't usually announce itself. It shows up quietly. When worship starts to feel hollow, when scripture only feels safe if it agrees with us, when prayer becomes guarded instead of honest. At that point, faith is no longer about relationship. It becomes evaluation. And evaluation demands control. This is the tension I don't want to skip over. Some of these questions are not just asking why something happened. They're asking what kind of God is allowed to exist after it happened. Is God only good if his actions make sense to me? Is he only worthy of trust if outcomes feel fair? Is God accountable to my moral reasoning the same way another human would be? Those questions feel reasonable, but they quietly relocate authority. They place us in the position of deciding whether God is acceptable. And Scripture simply doesn't place us there. That doesn't mean God is above goodness. It means he's the source of it. Which is why pain can explain why we ask these questions, but it cannot be the thing that defines who God is. And that boundary matters. Because when pain becomes the final interpreter, faith eventually collapses under the weight of disappointment. Not because the pain wasn't real, but because faith was asked to become something it was never meant to be. This also reframes prayer. Prayer isn't about updating God or negotiating outcomes. It's about staying in relationship when control is gone. That's why unanswered prayer is so destabilizing. It removes the sense that prayer is useful. It forces us to confront whether prayer was ever about results in the first place. When prayer is framed around outcomes, silence feels like rejection. When prayer is framed around presence, silence still hurts, but it doesn't end the relationship. Habakkuk never gets the explanation he wants. But listen to how the book ends. Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 17 and 18 says, "Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, yet I will rejoice in the Lord." That's not closure. That's commitment. Habakkuk doesn't say, "Now I understand." He says, "I'm staying." And that matters because a lot of what people are doing today isn't rejecting God outright. They're dismantling versions of faith that can't survive real suffering. That work isn't wrong, but deconstruction doesn't stay neutral forever. Over time, it moves toward rebuilding or toward departure. And what determines the direction isn't how many questions you ask, it's where your trust is placed while the answers remain absent. That decision rarely happens in a single moment. It forms quietly over time in how unanswered questions are treated, whether they remain part of the relationship or they become reasons to step outside of it. So, no, the questions don't need to be silenced, but they also can't be allowed to quietly take over the center. Christian faith does not promise clarity. It promises that God is trustworthy even when clarity never arrives. And that's not passive obedience, that's relational trust. So the real question isn't whether these questions belong. They do. The question is whether faith will remain oriented toward God or slowly become oriented around our need to understand. Those two paths feel very similar at first, but they lead very different directions. And that's worth naming honestly.
I don't want to end this by pretending everything is settled. It doesn't feel settled. Like it's not. These questions don't disappear just because they're spoken out loud. I mean, they don't magically soften. They don't resolve themselves, quickly. I mean, by saying them out loud, something changes. I mean, it takes away the shame. I feel like it takes away the feeling that you're the only one carrying this weight. It feels like it reminds me that this faith doesn't fall apart the moment like you're honest about something. And I do need to say this clearly. Like I'm not asking for permission to stop believing. I'm just asking for permission to be real about what belief is actually costing me.
Yeah, and I don't want to end this by offering answers that would close the conversation too quickly. Because some of the most important parts of faith don't live on the other side of explanation. They live in staying present, staying honest, staying in a relationship when clarity doesn't come. Faith doesn't mean you stop feeling the tension. It means you refuse to pretend it isn't there.
I think what hurts the most isn't that the questions exist. It's the loneliness that comes when you realize, you were never taught how to carry them with other people. Like you learn to perform certainty, you learn how to silence doubt. You don't learn how to grieve inside faith without assuming something is wrong with you. So if you're listening and you feel heavy after this, that doesn't mean you're failing. It might mean you're finally being honest.
Yeah, and honesty doesn't threaten faith. It does challenge shallow versions of it. Faith that can't survive questions was never strong to begin with. That doesn't mean faith is easy or comforting or predictable. It means faith is relational. And relationships don't end just because one side doesn't understand the other yet.
I don't need every question answered so that I can keep going, but I do need to know that asking them doesn't make me dangerous or unfaithful or broken. Just I just need permission to breathe.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this episode and you're somewhere in this tension, not rejecting faith, but not at peace with it either, Um, I want you to hear this. You don't have to rush. You don't have to pretend. You don't have to arrive at conclusions you're not ready to live inside. Faith is not fragile, and neither are you.
We're not here to close the conversation. We're just here to keep it honest.
And to keep it human. We'll see you next week.